Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I'm getting ready to feed some of my worm bins. But one thing you might have noticed in my recent feedings was that I've been omitting the grit because I just didn't have any. But earlier today I came down here and I took my collection of eggshells and I ran them through the little grinder that I have, and now I've got a nice replenished supply of ground up eggshell grit. So we're going to be returning to the inclusion of eggshell grit in our feedings. And another thing that we've been doing in recent feedings is trying to deplete a large supply of shredded paper that I had. And when I first started, it was a whole paper shopping bag full of shredded paper, and I'm at this point down to just a handful. And that's another cool thing, that I've been able to deplete that much shredded paper. Since that's not so much, I also went ahead and I took some cardboard that was laying around here and I packed that up into small pieces as well. So we're gonna have some nice bedding to include with our feeding, some nice grit, and the feeding itself is going to consist of something that we've seen in my feedings over the past couple weeks. It's still sort of holiday season, so that's why you're seeing a lot of apple, 2 more full apples like we've seen in previous feedings, a whole bunch of apple skins, apple peels, banana peels, a couple tomatoes. Whenever you see apple, that's usually a contribution from my mom. My mom, one of her favorite pastries to prepare is sort of like this apple tart, really delicious, sweet apple pastry, and every time she comes across an apple that just isn't up to par, it comes over here as worm food. And then you know, all the peelings that come off the apples before she incorporates the ingredient into her recipe also wind up into the worm food supply. So the containers that we're focusing on today are these 2 over here. This one here is now at the age of 105 days. This one's 91 days, 91 and 105. And the other third bin that's usually right here has now, for over 2 weeks now, been on a sort of a special assignment. I took that bin after it had been sort of resting for a couple weeks without any feedings, and I treated that bin to a full pumpkin. Not a very large one, you know, kind of a smaller sized pumpkin, and that bin is currently in the process of being time-lapse videoed to watch how the pumpkin gets depleted as the worms in the bin eat it. And so 2 of my 3 red wiggler bins are getting food today. So why don't we put my glove on, bring one of the bins over, and get started with this feeding. So here in the older of the 2 bins, I had put on a used coffee filter. My plan for this was to replace the feeding zone indicator. Last time I peeked in here, I had noted that the filter that was in here previously to indicate where I had last fed was starting to look a little bit tattered, so I figured I would just incorporate that old feeding zone indicator coffee filter into the bedding and just replace it with the new feeding zone indicator. I guess moisture seems to be holding up pretty good. One thing I did add recently was an additional layer of cardboard across the top, which seems to be helping tremendously. Prior to me putting that extra layer of cardboard in, I had been coming in here with the squirt bottle trying to maintain the moisture level by spraying water in here. But just with that additional layer of cardboard across the top, it just seems like it's helped tremendously, and it's enabled the bin to retain its moisture quite nicely. And I've not been adding water since, so that's a pretty nice improvement. Just scraping off the top half inch or so of material takes us down into almost like a castings only type consistency. Not castings only, there's still pieces of bedding, paper, cardboard, and I can already start feeling some of the food items. The first thing that I came across here is one of our test items, which is a peach pit. And I'm sure it's going to take a while. You know, the peach pit is a hard, very hard material. But I just keep bumping into it because we threw it in here as sort of a test to see how it goes. These are banana stems. And let's see what else we encounter as we work our way down. This feels like a little tiny piece of banana peel. Certainly not much left of it. And as we work our way down, we start to encounter other food items, such as this cantaloupe rind. Not much left of it. It's like a paper thin sheet of material. I guess all the fleshy melon has already been stripped off, so that it leaves just this thin skin of the not water, what is it, cantaloupe melon. It wasn't watermelon. I think I added watermelon to my vermi bags last time I fed, but this is cantaloupe melon. It's starting to get a little bit pungent, somewhat pungent odor of whatever food items were added in here recently, is what I think I'm smelling. Another banana peel, the stem of a banana peel, which really does get worked down pretty quickly. I don't know how old it is, but they really like to get in the middle of it, and they seem to really enjoy the fibrous material that it's made of, or that it consists of. Here we've got more cantaloupe, and here is like a little chunk that still has a little bit of the meaty part on there, and that's why it's all surrounded by worms. As we work our way down through this sort of stuff, the worms are everywhere. I believe this was a whole tomato. It's coming apart pretty nicely, seeds everywhere. Curious to see if they're going to sprout. We're going to get little seedlings growing in here. Now what is this? Oh, okay. The last time I fed, I was using some of these old, I've got a whole bunch of them, so I was using some of these old coffee filters to sort of create little burritos, if you will. So I had actually used the paper to wrap up the food, and it looks like it's actually holding the food together quite nicely. It kind of makes me curious to see what's the inside look like. I don't remember wrapping it up so tightly. I'm kind of surprised that it's this difficult to, you know, naturally I could use both hands, but I prefer to keep one hand clean. So in here, I believe this is a mango seed. And what else is in here? Apple, a whole bunch of apple peel. It's a label which we can remove right now as long as we're here. Get rid of that, because that's not going to get composted down. But it doesn't seem to have been a good thing to have had the food wrapped up like that, because it seems like the worms were almost unable to get at it, because it was a pretty tightly wrapped package. So I think the better bet here is just going to be to kind of keep the food items separate from that coffee filter to give the worms easier access to it. Taking forever to get through this. I don't know why. I get so distracted. I don't know why. I can't seem to resist poking around and checking stuff out and examining everything closely. This thing, I do not even know what it is, to tell you the truth. Can't really tell from the odor of it either. And the color, maybe cabbage. I guess from the color, it would be like that purple cabbage. Must have been like the stem, or the thicker piece of it. Now we're getting down to the bottom. And this would be some of the residual bits and pieces of the bedding that we had laid down previously. Looks like it's getting eaten up pretty good as the, I guess as the juices of the food make their way down into the bedding. It makes it a really palatable thing for the worms. So I guess, you know, paper is what? Nothing more than wood pulp or some sort of fairly easily edible food, I would guess, once it gets moist for the worms. So I've got a pretty good sized pile of old food items from previous feedings. not much of the old bedding to go around, so it's a good thing that we've got some fresh bedding to add to this feeding. Let's see if we can just move some of these little guys off to the side so we don't end up dumping a bunch of frozen food bits on top of them. But we will lay down some fresh bedding before we throw the food in. So let's start with that. Created a nice deep pit for them there. So here was that feeding zone indicator piece of paper, as well as this other piece of paper that we had salvaged from earlier. Let's throw these other pieces of older bedding back down into the pit. Okay, some more of this. Grab a handful of the shredded paper. Get it down there into the pit. I'll also throw in some of this cardboard. That's a pretty generous helping of fresh bedding for them. They should really enjoy that. Here's some more scraps of the old bedding. So let's go ahead and spread some of this old food out along the bottom. Kind of separate some of these old foodstuffs from this coffee filter. Get all this down here. I was also just curious, take a little peek on this side where we had piled all the food on top. I guess this is just all the worms burrowing down that were part of that. Trying to escape the bright lights overhead, so alright, whatever. The idea here was to not have worms in the feeding zone when I fill it with the fresh supply of frozen food, but I just completely undid that. I don't think they're going to mind. I think they'll do just fine. We'll just go ahead and we'll add the fresh supply of food, and if they don't like the cold, they'll just burrow down to get away from it. So I'm just going to try to apply this feeding in a somewhat consistent way. Try to leave enough of the allocated food for the other bin that we need to feed as well. Alright. I think that's kind of like a good 50-50 split. There were 2 tomatoes, 2 full apples. This is about half of the apple peels in this pile of whatever this leafy material is. I'm not sure what it is. But that to me looks like a pretty nice feeding, leaving enough for the next bin to receive about an equal quantity. Now back to something that these bins have not gotten in a couple weeks now, which is grit. So I've mentioned numerous times in the past recently that I'm trying to boost up the grit levels in my feedings a little bit better than I've been doing. So I'm glad to be able to include grit in this feeding. And another one of my staple food items is coffee grounds. So let's get this in here on top. And again, trying to save about half of it for the other bin that we need to feed. And that should pretty much get us to where we want to be with this bin. So I like the way things look in here. Definitely even like the moisture level out here on the edges. This is usually the real test, is to see how the stuff feels out on the outer edges where it's the most distant from the feeding zone, because that's the area that seems to get the least amount of moisture and has the most likelihood of drying out. So that's promising to see as well when you poke your fingers down into that area to find that the castings have a nice moist consistency to them. So I'm glad that I've finally got my moisture situation under control. It's kind of a drag having to come down here regularly to, you know, spray water onto the bins just to keep them from getting too dry and too uncomfortable. So it was really just as simple as getting another layer of cardboard on top. Alright. This material in this bin is really starting to look good. And you know, since we've already exceeded 100 days in age on this bin, it might actually be time soon to start this bin into sort of a downward sort of wind down mode to try to start getting it ready for harvesting at some point soon. I mean, that was what we had intended to do with the bin that's now in the pumpkin time lapse. So, you know, feeding it that pumpkin sort of broke the pattern of, you know, me not wanting to feed it for a while. So, here's our new feeding zone indicator. And let's get this thing covered up so we can get the next bin up here. Okay, looking good. Okay, so now this next bin is also red wigglers. Not much difference, maybe 2 weeks difference in age between the bin we just fed and this one. Like we mentioned earlier, I believe this one is at day 95 of age. And on this one, this feeding zone indicator seems to be holding up a little bit better. So we'll just stick with this one for now. But I don't think we're going to see many differences when it comes to these two bins. They've been managed very similarly to one another. And I tend to do that oftentimes because I find it helpful to have sort of a point of reference. Because if at some point you want to kind of troubleshoot what's going on in one of your bins, if you've got two bins that are, you know, kind of managed equally, then you can almost use one as a measuring stick to see how things should be expected to be progressing in the other bin. And if things are really off in one or the other bin, then, you know, that might be an indication of something that could require attention. So that's my only thinking in terms of sort of allowing bins to synchronize at some point, at least to a certain degree, just to help me a little bit with managing them. And here again, just like we found with the other bin, we have another peach pit. So both of these bins have peach pits in them. Yet another thing that kind of makes them similar to one another. So I think I'm going to pile the food up over here on the edge now instead of the end of the feeding zone, because then we can maybe more easily keep tabs on what we fished out of here and what we found. Pulling back the material. It feels almost like if it were just a little bit drier. The other interesting thing is, as I put my hands in here, it's probably just like a biomass, you know, the fact that there's just a whole bunch of living organisms here working, doing stuff. You can sort of feel a little bit of warmth. It's interesting. Temperature down here in my basement, it's January. But luckily the basement maintains a pretty consistent temperature. We've had a few warm days, so it's actually 65 degrees down here right now. But in the dead of winter, on the coldest days, it never even drops below 50. So it's a pretty good, stable environment for the worms. Some cabbage. These are all like the stem of a cabbage. This purple is also clearly purple cabbage or red cabbage, whatever that stuff is called. Here's another hunk of it. Now here we're getting into some of this older bedding material, some of this older shredded paper that we added recently. We'll definitely add that back into the feeding zone. But for now I'm just going to pull it aside so we can check it out and see how it's progressing. Got a lot of cabbage in here. And I wouldn't say it smells too bad. I mean, it definitely has sort of that, you know, cabbage smell to it. It could be worse, you know. I know some people just really don't like the smell of cabbage at all. But I guess maybe I'm a little bit biased because I do like cabbage and cabbage dishes. So for me, the smell of it decomposing is not quite as nasty as it might be for others. But normally, you know, when you're in your worm bins, you don't normally sense foul smells. But if if you feed heavily like I do, sometimes it does take a little while for the food that they've been given to be depleted, and it does sort of you know create a little bit of a stinky environment at times as the material kind of breaks down over time. But in time, it'll all get converted to castings, and it'll all just have a really nice earthy smell to it. So it's certainly temporary and nothing to be alarmed about. So I'm not worried whatsoever. This is also more paper. Seems to me almost as if the bedding that was added into this bin recently has sort of survived a little bit better since the last feeding. And it might also be fair to say that the food has survived too. I mean, it just seems like there's a lot more residual food from the previous feedings in here than the other bin seemed to exhibit. So as much as this bin appears to have a large quantity of worms in it, it just doesn't seem to be, breaking the food down as quickly as the first bin that we fed. And that's not a problem, it's just an observation. So I don't feel like I've got to address that, it's just an observation. But it is a curiosity because, it seems to me like it's just about the same setup and about the same number of worms. So it just makes you a little bit curious as to why it's progressing more slowly. So let's change things up here a little bit. Instead of putting the old bedding in first, let's take the fresh bedding this time and drop that in. This is the very last of my shredded paper collection. And that took a good month, I would say, for me to deplete, ultimately, to get to the very bottom of that bag. But I'm glad to have that off my composting table. It was starting to take up a little bit more space than I wanted. So it was nice to finally take that paper bag that it was all in and fold it up and set it aside, get it out of my way. So on top of the fresh bedding, I guess we'll start piling in some of this older bedding material. It's already nicely primed, so I'm sure the worms are going to appreciate that. Nice little combination of bedding and food. So now I think before we place in the old food, put this old food back in on top of the feeding zone, why don't we go ahead and we dump out the remainder of the food that's allocated to these guys. So let's see, I see there's some apple cores in here as well. Why don't I just take the whole bag and dump it? Oops. Just had worm food go flying all over the table. Luckily it was manageable and not too sloppy. Just one tomato rolled away and one apple peel. I believe I got it all. Yeah, got it all. Cool. So no big deal. It's interesting. This apple has been in the freezer all night. And you would think it would be hard as a rock, but it's not. So I wonder why. Kind of break it open a little bit and check it out. Surprised that it didn't freeze all the way through. It's weird. That's fine. Worms don't care. I just think that if the food's been frozen, it just seems to break down a lot more easily as it thaws out. It gets all nice and soft and mushy, and then the worms can definitely dive into it a lot more readily than if it was just put in here fresh. Here's this peach pit. We'll keep that down here in the middle of the action. Try to see if it ever goes anywhere. I'm sure it will in time, but I'm sure it'll also take quite some time. Get some of this stinky cabbage back down into the feeding zone. What else do we have here? Any other food bits? Yeah, mostly castings at this point. Okay. Well, let's not forget the last couple ingredients here, right? We want to throw in a nice supply of grit. Get back into the grit habit here. So that always seems to help a lot, you know? It's almost like giving the worms a utensil with which to eat. Okay. Coffee grounds. And we'll start covering up. Once again, I just want to take a little probe down into this outer edge that's furthest from the feeding zone to see how it is. It is also quite nice in terms of its kind of moisture level, its consistency. So this bin is a couple weeks older than the one we just fed. And the one thing I am noticing in here is a lot of these little sticks that are really nothing more than the stems of leaves. So all the leafy matter of all the leaves that I've used in this bin have been consumed, but it's just the stems of each leaf that still remains. So that's just something we didn't see in the previous bin, or at least not much of it, not this much at least. So I would have to guess that since this bin is only a couple weeks behind that other bin, that we should expect to start seeing all these little leaf stems to break down soon too. But then again, it did seem like that other bin is, you know, burning through its food supply a little bit more quickly than this one. So maybe it's not going to catch up in 2 weeks. It might just require a little bit more time. So down here, I don't know if I'm going to be able to fish it out. It's just so tiny and it just rolled down, but I am spotting I did see a worm cocoon down in there, which is a promising thing. I thought I just saw another one over here. It's just something that I really never really take the time to go looking for. But I guess it wouldn't hurt once in a while just to try to get a sense of how, you know, how reproduction in the bin is progressing, if at all, by trying to see if I could spot worm cocoons. But it is always kind of a promising thing to spot one while you're feeding. So I'm always happy to see a worm cocoon. They are pretty puny. I mean, right there, I think that's one right there. Barely visible. Fairly certain that it is a worm cocoon. And you can tell that that's part of the reason they're not normally spotted, because they are so tiny. So that's pretty much where we stand. All right, well, there's not much left to do here other than pack these guys up, put them back on the shelf, let them get back to work, and do a little bit of cleanup now that we're done feeding. So let me just take this as an opportunity to say thank you. Thank you for keeping me company and for watching my video. If you enjoyed what you saw here and you're interested in seeing more, then consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. Hitting the bell would give you notifications that I've got new stuff online. And by all means, if you enjoyed the video, also remember to give me a thumbs up. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thanks for keeping me company. And hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Take care. Bye now.